This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest reviewer, the new Heather. She reviewed the podcast on podchaser.com. You too can rate and review the podcast on podchaser.com, the Apple Podcast Store. You can rate the podcast on Spotify and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Please consider joining the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group, where we are trying to provide a safe place to land for those people who are questioning, deconstructing, deconverting, and on the other side. That can be found at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. Arline guest hosts today, and she interviews Boundless and Free. Boundless and Free is a psychotherapist focusing on trauma. She has a very significant Instagram presence where she describes her work as exploring the intersections of mental health, trauma, embodiment, and religious trauma. Arline and Boundless and Free go through a lot of different subjects: religious trauma, purity culture, the embodiment of trauma, and the ways out, the hope on the other side. Here is Arline interviewing Boundless and Free.
Hello, Boundless and Free. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yes, I'm excited to have you. I'm not sure how many months ago I came across, I'm sure it was recommended to me based on other people I follow on Instagram. I found your account and I just fell in love with
Aww.
everything that you post and the way that you post them, the wording, the captions, like worthy of sharing with other people and worthy of letting it sink down into my heart. So I was really thankful for your account. And I've gotten to chat with you over the months and really enjoyed getting to know you. And so I wanted to hear your story. And yes, usually how we begin is tell us about your spiritual upbringing, in as much as you're comfortable with sharing.
Sure, I'd love to. So I grew up in the PCA church, the Presbyterian church, and that's different from PCUSA. So
That's the more conservative one, yes?
yes, it is. And it's very Calvinistic, I would say. So a lot of people are aware of that kind of definition, when you say that, Calvinism. So total depravity, predestination, some of those kind of heavy duty theologies is kind of what I was brought up in, was really committed in youth. I was definitely the youth group kid. I think I got the Christian award in high school, which is funny that they even give that out. It was obviously a Christian high school. Mm-hmm. And so I dated a youth pastor. I mean, he was a high school student, so don't get any weird ideas. But I was all in, for sure. And it's funny because my dad was actually basically agnostic, and he never went to church with us. So he was home on Sundays, watching NASCAR and going to play music in bars in Key West, which was awesome now that I look at it. Yeah. I know. So, but my mom was the one who kind of took us to church every weekend, which is funny because it didn't seem like it was a super major thing in her own life. It was just kind of this minor thing. But I think being the firstborn overachiever, perfectionist, whatever that we are, I definitely just took it to heart, when I went there and made it my identity. And yeah, it became a big part of my life. So
I'm familiar with PCA. I did not grow up in the church, but when I became a Christian, it was through a campus ministry that was out of a PCA church.
Okay.
So yeah, when I joined the church, I was coming from a Baptist church, and the elder board was like, "Do you know what you're getting into?" And I was like, I hope so. Good grief. Oh my gosh. Yes. So that's what you grew up, the Calvinism.
Yes.
And
women were not allowed to be teachers, another big thing. And so, yeah, I did. And so I think that framed a lot of, it's funny because I don't think as negatively affect me as I think it could have growing up. I feel like I always had like a positive relationship with God or whatever that was, like spirit, on my own terms. And so the messaging that they gave of total depravity and, original sin and not doing anything in yourself to be able to bring yourself to God, those didn't really sink in as harmful as they really are until later in my life. And so, I mean, because I hear some of those ideas now, and I'm a therapist now. And so, and I just skipping ahead a little bit, once I became a preschool teacher at a Christian school and teaching these children these things, I was just like, oh, wow. Like, and I had my own kids, and I'm like, we can't teach humans. I can't look in this 3-year-old's eyes and tell them they're completely depraved and that they, are the reason that God had to send his son Jesus to die on the cross. Like, this is going to harm this child's psyche. There is no way around it, and so I think the depravity of that theology and the harmfulness of it has only really sunk in since I've left the church, which is really fascinating. I always had a problem with, it's funny, I was such a dork in high school. I was like thinking about predestination, like I should have been being a teenager, and here I am thinking about predestination. That's how messed up, right? It was, right? And I know so many people had that experience. But I'm like, so with predestination within Reformed theology, the idea is that God, in his ultimate wisdom and mercy, chose some to be predestined. And then I don't know, do you know much about predestination?
I do, but our audience may not.
Yes. And so the other side of this is God chose some to be saved. Okay. He literally picked some people out, not based on anything they could do or not do. And in his mercy, right? Grace and mercy, big, big words in the PCA church. Okay. But the other part that they don't talk about, which is actually written about, Calvin talked about it, it's this idea of double predestination, which if God chose some people to be saved, that means he also chose some people to be damned. And this is something even kind of Paul discusses, the whole objects of wrath idea. And if he chose some, to be saved, who are we to question God if he chose some, he bore in all his patience to be objects of his wrath. I'm sure I'm butchering it a little bit, but that's the general idea. And that idea, I remember ever since I was little, just never sat with me. No matter how many men, no matter how many big, strong, white leader men told me this is the way it was, I remember my 14-year-old girl heart was just like, no, this is not right. I know this is not right. And this does not match up with whatever spirit God figure I've had experience with, which is probably the only reason I was able to stay with it for as long as I did. So yeah.
Yeah. I've heard in lots of people's stories, like I did not grow up in the church, but when they're kids, their bodies and their brains know something's not right. Like I know I'm supposed to believe this, but this doesn't. It makes my son would use the phrase like it makes my tummy hurt. Like it just something is not right.
Sure. Yeah.
With this idea that yes, God is all loving and God is kind. And, all those big. I don't even remember the theological words for these. And God will condemn, like you said, double predestination, predestine people for hell. And the hard part for us, for Donnie and my husband and me in Calvinism, there at the very end, was that we just had to be okay with this. And after so many years, it was like my husband couldn't be okay with it. He's like, I just can't believe that this is true anymore. So going back to high school and then into what did like your 20s and college time look before you became a teacher? Before you taught?
This feels like so long ago now. I'm 41 now. So I ended up, I went to school for music. I was actually a singer and played in a band and wrote music and all this stuff. Yeah. And so back in the day, wanted to be a Christian musician.
Of course, naturally.
And I ended up thinking I wanted to go to school in Nashville, Tennessee. So I went to school for music in Miami for a year. They have a great music school there. And then I started to experience what I would later realize were depression symptoms. Didn't realize that then because, if you're a Christian, you can't get depressed, of course. And so during my school year at I started to experience some of these, depression, anxiety symptoms that were connected. And kind of starting to go into this existential crisis a little bit about belief in the world. And I told you I was just a ball of fun. Okay. So considering what's the meaning of life, do I really believe all this stuff? Okay. So I ended up changing my major from music to religion. And I ended up transferring, to a little religious school in Nashville, Tennessee called Belmont University. That actually ended up being great because they were right next to Vanderbilt University. So they ended up getting a lot of their professors from this really, forward-thinking divinity school. It was great. And so, I ended up majoring in religion and minoring in philosophy and didn't have any clue what I'd use that for. I'm a 4 on the Enneagram. So if that gives you any idea, we're not the most practical of people, right?
Yes, I do understand what that means.
Yes. So, just following my heart and my soul and trying to discover the meaning of the universe, So depression symptoms went away for a while there. I got back into, I still wanted to be a Christian musician, kind of at that point. It's so funny to think about now. Which so did everyone, right, at that school and in Nashville.
You're in Nashville. You're in
everyone
Nashville.
wanted to be
Mecca.
Right. Yes. So had a band, did music while I'm also doing this religion major stuff. And it was great. It was a very interesting experience. It's so funny because half the people I probably knew there have since come out as like gay or, queer, which is, of course, it's a music school in the middle of the Bible Belt. And so, it's fun to see where people's lives have taken them. But so I had a really good experience, and then nothing really major happened. And then I graduated, and there was a lot of pressure from my dad. He was a really practical guy. And it was always about finding a job, provide for yourself, which is great. I have kids now. I totally understand, but it was a lot of stress. And I also started to, my depression symptoms at this point started to kick back up. And I was at the point I was writing my thesis I was in the honors program at Belmont. And I'm writing this thesis and like not sleeping. Like I had completely stopped sleeping. I'd stopped dreaming. I like couldn't feel joy anymore. At the time, my mom was really scared of any idea of antidepressants and stuff like that. So she was kind of not wanting me to go that route. So basically, I did everything I possibly could to get over my depression naturally because I'd been a Christ follower all my life. I hadn't had sex before marriage. I was devoted. I spent every morning praying and had done all the devotionals, and I was a youth leader and, all the things. And so what did I have to be depressed about? I just couldn't understand it. And the irony now is like I'm a trauma therapist. And so I understand a lot more about depression and anxiety, I'd like to think. And so I look back on my sweet young self and I'm like, honey, what do you mean you had nothing to be depressed about? Let's look at all the things, especially I think with complex PTSD survivors. So for our listeners, there's a big difference, between PTSD and complex PTSD. Complex can be much more subtle. So typically, a lot of us know we have complex PTSD if we're hearing ourselves say, it wasn't that bad.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm.
If we compare our experiences to other people's, and we're constantly saying, well, I didn't have it as bad as that. So we can't validate our own traumas and our own negative experiences. It may not be sexual assault or something that you want to kind of put up on the pedestal, of the really big traumas. I had both my parents. I had a decent upbringing. I had people that loved me. So the fact that I didn't get my emotional needs met completely and I didn't feel seen and I felt shame from this underscore religious, like toxic culture and other things that were happening. Like I just couldn't even conceive or see where those came from at that time in my life. So, I did what every good Christian does, and you just pray and you have people pray for you and you work out and you eat right and you do all the things. And it just wasn't working. Mm-hmm. So my body was literally deteriorating and probably shutting down. And the turning point was I finally, again, I'm a stubborn firstborn. So I was like, well, we can fix this. I'm going to go to a sleep clinic and they're going to do all these tests on me. And they're going to find out I have this amazing, unique sleep deprivation thing going on. Okay. And it's going to be big. And so I sign up for this sleep clinic and I show up and I walk in and the doctor comes in and he takes one look at me. This
wow.
is like a 30-second appointment. And he goes, hi, yeah, how are you doing? What are some things you like doing? And I said, oh, well, I like playing music, And he said, are you doing that currently? Are you doing that anymore? And I said, no, I'm not really. And he said, why? That's what he said. And I don't think I had an answer, And then he took out his little doctor pad and he wrote something down and he handed it to me. And he said, I can't remember, something like, I hope you feel better soon. Have a great day, And on the little legal pad was the words like moderate depression is what he had written down, a diagnosis of moderate depression. And he had seen so many people at that point that he just knew. He knew that's what was going on. Yes.
And so he was like, you need to get back to singing and playing music. Was that?
No, he was he didn't. He was probably, I don't even know if he told me what to do next, but it was basically like, you need to meet with a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. No, we're not going to do the sleep clinic testing with the lab and all the people watching me sleep and all this stuff. This is not happening for me. I get to go, so there was no more denying it. I needed to go see a doctor and get tested or get talked to and all these things that I was not sure about anything. I'd never been to see a therapist. It wasn't talked about. Yeah. I think I'd seen some spiritual directors and youth group leaders and things like that,
Yeah, I was going to ask because that's what we would run into is anything you struggled with, you went to the pastor. Never mind, he may or may not have any training or any kind of licensing to tell you anything at all.
Exactly.
That's who you were sent to, or your small group leader or your Bible study leader, who again is just, can listen perhaps, but like really, should not be put in a position where they have to do more than be a friend or listen.
Right. Not to mention they're biased and they don't have the education. And now so much we know about depression and anxieties, it's a physical, a physical problem with your body. It has, a very strong connection to what's going on in your body. It's not just something you can snap out of. It's not just a mood, So there's chemicals and there's different levels that are changing and working, and those have to be managed as well. So for me, that meant going to a doctor and getting a prescription for antidepressants. And my mom freaked out, was terrified.
Do you know what she was afraid of? Like, do you know what
You
the fear
know,
was?
I am not sure unless it's just like I think she was almost afraid of antidepressants because I think she'd heard like, oh, those are for intensely disturbed people, or those can hurt you, or they're intense on your body. I'm not really sure actually. I might have to ask her that someday. But she was obviously, she wanted me to go to different directions. She kind of tried to get involved in like my treatment plan. I remember my doctor had to be like, "Ma'am, you cannot have access to your daughter's treatment plan."
Nice.
And she at this point lived in Florida. Like I'm in Tennessee. She's in another state. And so
Yeah.
this is her. I think she was probably like, oh my God, what did I do to my child? Like,
Yeah.
so there's some of that fear of like, oh, is there something she's not telling me? Is she,
Mhm.
what did we do wrong? Which, again, complex PTSD, my family was good enough. They were great. Yes, there were some needs they didn't meet, but it was a bigger picture. So he prescribed me an antidepressant, and I think I actually had to try one that did not do great, which sadly is the story, especially back then when they didn't have the saliva tests that they have now that can kind of limit it number, uh, give you a better idea of which to start with.
Mhm.
So I tried one, it didn't work. And then I got on another combination. And probably within weeks, I just felt so much better. It was like something in my
Wow.
body had been missing for years and years,
Mhm.
and it just regulated.
Mhm.
Um, and that was a huge realization, I think, because so many people in the church don't even talk about it. They don't talk
Yeah.
about mental health, they don't talk about antidepressants. So I ended up going to a psychiatrist, and I got a prescription for a medication.
Mhm.
Um, and I started taking it. And yes, there were a few side effects, but at this point, my health had been so bad. The physical effects of my depression were so bad. And the funny thing is, let me rewind because people misunderstand anxiety and depression a lot. They are very connected, they're often two sides of the same coin. Depression often gets a bad rap and people don't like to talk about it quite as much because it's scary and it's dark.
Mhm.
But all of my symptoms started as anxiety symptoms. So I couldn't sleep, I couldn't make decisions, I felt anxious around people all of a sudden. And I had never experienced depression before.
Mhm.
And then they all kind of switched once I started, on this one medication. They switched over and changed into more depressive symptoms. So,
Mhm.
as you talk to people, a lot of times they're very connected. So I started, the medication, and I think within weeks, I started feeling like myself again. It was unbelievable.
Wow. Mhm.
Yeah. So, and it was kind of a come to Jesus moment, if you will, because that's not talked about in the church at all. I'm trying to remember, put myself back in that space, but so much of the church just denies mental health as being important or even
Mhm.
as being existent.
Mhm.
I think hopefully that's changing some, but when I was, in my 20s, I hadn't heard anyone talk about mental health.
I'm 39, and it's only been, this is my little anecdotal, what I've seen. At the tail end of when I was still in the church, let's see, that would have been 2019, there, like Brene Brown's work had
Mm-hmm.
kind of infiltrated like mom hangout Bible study world.
Yes.
And there was one guy who took, in my opinion, it was a book we were supposed to read for a book club, and these were all Christians and me. I guess maybe I was still a Christian, I'm not sure. But he had basically taken Daniel Siegel's like
Oh,
neuroscience
yeah.
and Brene Brown's emotion stuff and put it together and then put Bible verses to it. So there I am being furious because I'm like, he's taking other people's work and trying to make it biblical. Yeah, and trying to make it be
Yes.
biblical
Mm-hmm.
when from being a Calvinist for so long and reading the Bible through a certain lens, I was like, this is bullshit. Like, this is
Yes.
so ridiculous. But now I look at it as like, well, maybe there's something happening in the church where people are taking mental health more seriously. So hopefully that would be helpful. I've heard lots of people say, though, the more mental health is taken seriously and people get healthier, the less they're going to have religion, because
Yeah.
religion was kind of the medication, perhaps. I don't know if that's the
Hmm.
right word for.
For the unknown and for the stress of life and for the fear of death. Yeah, it definitely acts like that for a lot of people.
Yes, here's your God that can help you in this
Hmm.
situation. Here's
For sure.
prayer. Here's your community that can rally around when you're struggling. So, yeah, I'm curious to see how the next, you know,
I
years will
know.
go. And I'm sure, I don't know about other, like, I'm only familiar with white evangelicalism. I'm curious are you familiar with any? I know this is an aside, but like how other churches in the United States, other like ethnicity based church world, mental health, anything there? I don't
I'm
know.
not sure. I'm sure
Hmm.
I know more Eastern cultures are more
Hmm.
open to,
Yes.
Eastern medicine and things like that. And they have a much more balanced view of the body and the mind. And so it feels very much like an evangelical thing of
Hmm.
like anything in the world is bad. We must deny the world, and adhere to this otherworldly thing is the only thing we can save, that can save us. So it does feel like an evangelical thing, I think.
And there's a big emphasis on like your life here is just temporary, so
Right.
it's not
Yes,
nearly as important as this other world we'll all supposedly go to.
exactly. Which goes into like why we don't need to take care of our bodies and why our bodies aren't important and why the earth isn't important and all those things that snowball together.
Yes, they snowball together, and it just, oof, it can.
Yes.
Then church people are like, I don't understand why no one wants to become a Christian or join
Right.
church. I'm like, well, there's a long list of things, of reasons.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so what happened? What happens next?
So you made me think of something too, because I think a big message in this that I'd actually kind of forgotten, and as we're talking, it's reminded me, is this whole idea of like denial of the body was a big part
Mm-hmm.
of growing up, and that includes purity culture, that includes not spending time making yourself attractive or not spending too much time thinking about your body and knowing it's more about the work we're doing for heaven, and our body is just temporary and things like that. And so I think when my body, started to break down, which now I see and know from trauma, it was its way of telling me something was wrong. It was trying to get
Yes.
my attention and say, hey, you're missing out on something here. You're missing something. You need to pay attention to this. Up until that point, my body was just, it's a thing to be cast aside so that I could live life for the kingdom or whatever,
Mhm.
for God. And this was finally the time where my body said, stop. Like, no,
Mhm.
you cannot continue doing anything until you deal with this stuff, which was a big wake up call. And I bet it could be taken like, oh, my body broke down. And instead, it was kind of like, oh, wow, my body is this big source of wisdom and this big guide that
Yeah.
that can teach me, what's important and doesn't want me to push that stuff down. And I don't think I've ever let go of that, since then. Is like, and that's just, it was a big, like, oh, this is not what the church necessarily talks about. So there were all these things coming up of like, well, the church said this was true, but actually this is my experience, So all these little things of like starting to make me question at least like what I would had been taught, about what God was and what spirituality is.
So there were little things happening that, how did you say it? Your experience and what you had been taught were not lining up.
Right. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and that would just continue, of
Mhm.
course.
So yeah, tell me more.
Yes, yes. So, I think also the whole idea of like God will, guide your life and guide you into what you're supposed to do. And, which I must say, I have definitely experienced some of that. I still consider myself spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely a lot more meandering,
Good word.
and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, unknown along the way than kind of they
Mm-hmm.
prepare you for. So a big thing that comes up is, they talk about marriage in Christianity a lot, very blatantly, as if you wait, right, and you pray and you meet this one person and you get married, then everything's going to go really great, and your marriage is going to be really, God's going to bless it, and you're going to be happy and fulfilled, and it's going to be wonderful. And so I'd been told all these things about waiting for my husband, and I did meet a great person, a great man who had also grown up in purity culture and church, and we got married. And pretty soon we realized that it was not everything that we thought it would be,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of he was pretty shut down in terms of how much he could interact with me physically and sexually, even responding to me, um, because of his upbringing in purity culture.
Oh,
So
wow.
he was really turned off. Um, and that was something I had not been prepared for.
Oh.
You think that you're going to meet this person that also believes in God, and you're going to get married, and then it's going to be crazy sex on the wedding night and amazing sex forever after that, and and I had really idealized this relationship and this idea. And so it just kind of, I remember just thinking, wow, I'm not that person to him. I'm not like this ideal, perfect,
Mm-hmm.
person that he's obsessed with, that you think, the male is supposed to be obsessed with. And I took that very personally,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so it was hard. And it took it. I mean, we're still married.
Mm-hmm.
It took about 10 years for us to work through that.
There's such binary thinking within evangelicalism. Women are not supposed to be sexual and are supposed to be the gatekeepers and will do it for their husbands, and husbands are supposed, and the men are supposed to be very visual creatures and they want sex all the time, and just,
Yes.
and those are the only
And there's
choices.
no
Like,
in between. Right.
there's no
Exactly.
nuance to anyone just having a different personality, or like, in the past year or two I've learned, lot demisexual and asexual, all these different
Yes.
words that I never even knew existed or had not been coined yet, because it was just, there are two genders and those two genders act this way and that's it. Men are
Right.
from Mars and women are from Venus. Like, that's all you had. And purity culture is not, like, toxic masculinity and purity culture and patriarchy. They harm they harm our
Mm-hmm.
hubbies. They harm the men in our lives, the boys,
Yes,
and
very much. On a core, very somatic
yes.
level. Yeah.
I don't remember who said this, but I've heard it said, women are taught their bodies are bad, boys are taught their minds are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And they just,
Yes.
and it's, oh, that's hard. Yeah,
Yes.
that's hard.
Yes. And so to be good, which is another thing we're taught, is the good child. We have to be the good child to get any favor, from God, or we're going to be dismissed. we They really go and try to be really good. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
us, we tried really hard to follow the rules, and it has a cost, and had a cost for a lot of people, in that culture. And we're seeing the effects of that now. I mean, most of us are in therapy, we are
Yeah.
holding on to these things, because we were alienated from our bodies. And we were told that this home that we live in, this beautiful, trustworthy home that we live in, was bad and wrong and would lead us astray. We couldn't trust it. We couldn't trust our own inclinations, any of it, And while I do think, yes, of course, we can make poor choices sometimes, right? Everyone
Oh,
knows
yeah.
that,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there's a big difference from saying we can make poor choices and I am completely bad. I am instinctually wrong. Something is wrong with me and evil, basically. So
Yes. Yeah.
That's a big difference. And so feeling like you're very rotten in the core of you and that you can't make any good decisions on your own, I think leads to this alienation from our bodies and from our sense of self too, so that we don't even know who we are, a lot of us. And I mean, I got married when I was 27, and so my husband was 30. This is a 30-year-old man who wanted, in some way to connect sexually, because we do now, and was unable to for 10 years, to the point of like he couldn't even verbally talk about how he was attracted to me. It was literally that shut off. And I know that's not rare. That's the sad thing,
Yeah.
Of course, it's differing degrees to each personality type, but especially for someone who's more sensitive or more quiet, that could definitely have a really detrimental effect on their ability to interact.
I am sure that there are lots of men in the deconverted world who can very much empathize with that
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah, I think that was hard just because I'd been waiting to feel beautiful, desired, sexual, and that just didn't come. And so there was a need there that I'd never let really get fulfilled because I shut that off during my younger life, and was waiting for marriage to kind of be the magic cure all. And then it didn't get there. So, yeah. So there were many years there where I was just kind of like trying to figure out what we're supposed to do. And we should have gone to counseling. We didn't. Because we had children. That's why. We were busy. We had kiddos, and so we were working. He was working a lot. I was home with the kids. And so, yeah, I think it just kind of got pushed to the side. It's not something you can talk about with a lot of different people, I don't think. So, and we were doing okay. It wasn't, we were doing good enough, right?
Yep. If things are not, no one's blowing up and fighting and there's all this, there's not adultery, we're fine. We're fine. Everything's fine. The house is on fire behind us, but we're fine. Everything's fine.
But like you'd said, like you'd never even heard the words like asexual or bisexual, maybe, I'm not sure which ones you hadn't heard, but for me, I hadn't heard of polyamorous until I was, oh my goodness, 36 or so,
Oh, yeah. No, same.
Yeah.
It's been in the last however many years. I think Esther Perel was the first time I started, and I don't even know where I first heard about her. Started going, wait, there's a whole lot of the world that I just don't know about in relationship and marriage. Yeah. And I didn't
Yes.
even grow up in the church.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Yeah. So what do you think kept you sheltered from that conversation?
Well, I think with the vocabulary, a lot of it is newer. Now
Okay.
I knew bisexual, I knew straight and gay, but so I knew that, but even then I knew probably tropes or stereotypes
Mm-hmm.
of these different sexualities. But as far as gender fluidity and different sexualities, yeah, it's only been in the last few years that after deconverting, at some point I started learning like, oh, there are other ways of being in the world that I just did not know existed.
Yes. Beautiful ways of being. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful ways. Like ethical non-monogamy that won't just destroy everything because my husband and I we had only ever heard you get married and you marry one person and everything, even if it's not magical, like that is God's ideal. That I think
Yes.
would be the phrase. And I had not seen that in other people's marriages. I had not, we had not always had the perfect marriage. And the idea was if you got a divorce or did anything differently, it was going to destroy your kids, it was going to destroy
Right.
you. There was no like possibility of anything different for people.
No. Yeah, definitely. And it would be displeasing to God. I don't know if you
Mm,
got that, but I remember that message.
I'm sure. Well, it was definitely
Nothing different.
sinful.
Right.
Yes. Anything was just sinful. It was either good, godly or sinful, from the spirit or from the flesh. Yep.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
So when did you start like, okay, I need to start pulling apart the things that I've believed forever and ever.
Yeah, I think it's slowly just been, life had been unraveling it this whole time, honestly, because these pieces that were foundational were slowly just kind of falling apart. Like, oh, I thought it was this way. And I thought if we did this certain way in this certain life, we would get, it would go by these certain things. And that was proving not to be true. I remember I worked at this bakery after college, and there was this wonderful woman who, in the midst of my depression, was just so kind and encouraging, and would come in and work with me and kind of just be present. She was very spiritual. She was a teacher at Vanderbilt, a divinity teacher, and we developed a really strong friendship. She was older than me. She was about 15 years older than me. And I remember one morning sitting down to breakfast with her, and she asked me about a relationship I'd started, and I'd said, "What about you? Are there any guys in your life?" And she kind of chuckled a little bit and looked at me, and she's like, "Oh, I thought you knew." And I was like, "Knew what?" And she goes, "Oh, I'm gay." And I remember just being kind of in shock. Well, A, my gaydar was not on at all at that point in my life. And B, this person had completely shown themselves to be a completely undeniably spiritually strong person, who was in communication with God, who was kind and loving and encouraging and gay. And I was right. And I was like, but these things can't exist. This is what the church has told me. This does not exist. You can't be a Christian and be gay, So there were these little breadcrumbs, I feel like the universe has kind of tossed my way, almost like, we need to get you out of religion, but we don't want to rip it out of your hands too fast because you're going to freak out. So we're going to do it in these slow little ways. My husband ended up leaving the church when we moved to Colorado. I think for him, he just started already seeing a lot of the discrepancies, and a lot of it happened when we had girls. We had 2 girls, and in the Presbyterian church, they're treated differently. Women are treated differently, maybe not outright, but you're not allowed to be a teacher. You're not allowed to be a leader. It's very, very blunt, open that women are not the same as men. And I know they want to say, well, that doesn't mean their value is any different, but sorry, I don't know that I agree with that. I think that's the teaching,
Yeah, it's hard to value certain positions over other positions and then say only one gender gets those more valuable positions, and not accidentally or on purpose value one gender over
exactly.
the other gender.
Yeah. I was like, you can't have it both ways. So
No.
Either you value us or you don't. Yes. And so for him, he was just like, I'm done with it, which was pretty brave. And I was still hanging on, desperately clinging to try to not leave the church. And I think the culmination ended up happening. I was just listening to B's podcast, and he had mentioned 2016, being a big year.
That year.
Right. Okay. And then subsequently 2020, obviously. A lot of things just started to unravel. And I think I'd been pushing a lot of things under the rug that could no longer be pushed under the rug at that point. It's kind of like a very, very distinct culmination. So at this point, I'd had my children. I'd stayed home with them, which was in itself a very big, intense, eye-opening experience. Props to all the stay-at-home moms, because wow. And then I'd started working at their Christian preschool as a teacher just because they asked me to. And no, I did not have any training whatsoever,
Oh, wow.
which is allowed at private schools, just to hire whoever you want. Okay. So yes, I ended up with a class of about 30 3 and 4-year-olds. I worked there for about 3 or 4 years. Yeah, I know, it was a lot. It was an amazing experience, because it just blew my mind for how much these young people can actually learn and have autonomy and really take charge, and how you can, work with a large group of children that way and have them respect you and respect themselves. And it was a really beautiful opportunity. We used a lot of Charlotte Mason. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
We tried to be Charlotte
oh, good
Mason
old Charlotte.
homeschoolers. I loved it. I was like, of course we'll read all these great classic books. And my boys were like, or we could read graphic
Right.
novels and watch YouTube. I was like, okay. So yeah.
Yes, it's a beautiful idea. And yeah. So some of the things were really beautiful about the school, but then there was I just remember having to teach the Easter lesson. And the whole year, they kind of build it up, right? The whole year, you're talking about Jesus, you're talking about what a wonderful man he is and all the love he's shown to everybody, and how he's performed miracles, and he's been kind to people that are the outcasts. So these children fall in love with this person of Jesus very strongly, because that's what you want. That's what they wanted to happen. And then it's kind of like, okay, well, Easter Sunday's coming. We got to get ready for this. So we got to teach that final, lesson about Good Friday. This is a big one. So these children, you have the big like Bible that you're showing to the kids that has all the illustrated, pictures of Jesus, and then you tell them about how he, he was arrested and then charged and, brutally assaulted and, put up on a cross to die. And there's pictures and blood, because you want people to know the gravity of this. These 3 and 4-year-olds, and then you're supposed to tell them the message, that it's because of their sin that Jesus was put on the cross.
Oh man.
It's, because of their inability to please God and to be what God wants and what God created them to be, that Jesus had to die, this brutal death. So this friend that they'd made is killed for them, Luckily, I had enough awareness that I didn't teach it that way. Okay.
Yeah.
I skirted around it. I said, yes, he died, and yes, here's Easter kind of thing. But this was the message that they wanted preached. This was the message that countless churches want preached. They want people to feel sorry, and to repent and to feel awful about themselves and their choices, And I remember a mom in our class, a mom of a child in our class afterwards telling us in the teacher's lounge, because she was also a teacher, and she was just so happy that her child, had come to her and said, Mom, why can't I go to heaven with Jesus? And the mom had said, because your sin separates you from being able to be with him, and she was so happy that her child could accept that she was so depraved that only Jesus, his blood and his sacrifice could save her. And I just knew that was something I could no longer teach to children, let alone my children. I think I'd gotten my counseling degree at that point, but I hadn't been practicing. So I knew some about psychology, but I just knew that this was a very damaging and detrimental, belief. So yeah, that it's funny because that happened. And then right afterwards, I knew I was on the way out. I was trying to figure out how to get out because we were pretty entrenched in that community. And then COVID happened, voila.
There you go. Yes, lots of people have said March of 2020 was the last time we went to church.
Yeah. And the last day I was in class was my birthday, which is ironic. Yeah. And I never thought, I was surprised that we'd never go back, I wouldn't have ever thought that, but that was the last day I was there. And I'm glad. I think it was really good. I did not want to be there anymore. I'm glad I got my kids out before I think they got that message in their heads.
Yes.
That was a big thing. It's hard though, because when you're in it, it's really hard to know if you're making the right decision. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of shame. Yeah. It's hard to pull away. So COVID made it really easy for us, and then on top of that, it didn't stop because sadly, the conservative churches were often the ones that were not being careful, and they didn't believe in being careful or taking care of other people's lives. My mom had been diagnosed with lung cancer right at the beginning of COVID. And my sister was working in an emergency room in Florida. And so they were like front line in the midst of this. And here I have this school telling me, no, we're not going to wear masks when we go back to school. This is just not what we believe. Yeah, very blatantly. And people would actually get mad at me for thinking we should. I remember feeling absolutely crazy. Do you remember this? Yeah.
Oh yeah. It was a strange, like people who are not Christians are going, wait, I thought this whole thing was like love your neighbor.
Right.
Why is this difficult?
Yes. And you're like, am I crazy? Am I missing something here?
Yes.
This is not adding up. Yeah. I don't understand why you can't see why these two go together, even if you're not the one who's sick, even if you don't know, because we didn't know what the science was, right? Why don't you err on the side of caution for these other people? I don't know. Does it hurt you? I know a mask is a really big inconvenience, but I'm just saying, if it saves somebody's life, why not err on the side of caution? And, for me, it was my mom thinking about, she's one of those people. So, and then I just remember there was just so many things. And then it was like Black Lives Matter happened. And I remember posting about that thinking, oh my God, all of my friends will totally be on the same page as this. And just, it was crickets. And it was disgust whenever I'd post something supporting Black Lives Matter. Not from everyone. You can't say that, but from enough.
Oh, yeah.
From enough, which I know so many people had that same exact experience. So, and then Trump, obviously, so many people in support of him. And that was just so odd. So I think that was it was just an explosion. I'd been like slowly inching away. And then this thing almost happened like a gift in retrospect, which was not, obviously, but
yeah,
it allowed me to kind of have a clean break, and not have to keep going to church and kind of get out of it. So, yeah. Because it can be scary. Honestly, I think a lot of what was keeping me in church was the fear of leaving, and fear of, is that the right thing? Is it wrong? Am I going to drift from God? Because you have this whole belief of like, you have to be in the word and around believers or you're going to be sucked into the world. There's this fear of the world. And, so I was scared. I was scared if I wasn't immersed in this culture that I was going to lose my way or whatnot, and it just didn't happen. I mean, I'm sure plenty of people would say I have. But I feel better and more free and happy and closer to spirit in my own life than I ever have, So
that was actually my next question. Where do you feel like you are now?
Yeah. I think I'll hopefully always be in a place of openness and wonder and curiosity for the rest of my life. I hope. I have some ideas about where I think I am right now. I really like the book A Course in Miracles. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
A Course on Miracles?
Yes, A Course in Miracles. And it has kind of creepy like roots about where it came from. It was supposedly transcribed to this woman, which of course was sending off all my alarm bells and red flags,
Yeah.
As a Christian, I was like, no way. And then, but the book just, it feels really good to my spirit and my soul. And it's a lot more expansive. It still uses some of the Jesus words and ideas behind it. But it reframes a lot of it as, we are safe in God. Nothing could ever separate us from, God and God's love. Nothing we could do, can actually change who we are, who we were created to be. So, it was just this message of, I don't have to try anymore, which I feel like in Christianity is all about trying. yes, there's grace, but fruit is, a tree is known by its fruit, so you better keep trying.
It's interesting because, yes, Calvinism is very much like God has chosen people, God picks, God. However, if you
Right.
do not walk the walk, then you have just proven you were never a Christian, or, however it would be
Yes,
framed. And so
exactly.
you may not walk around worried you're going to lose your salvation, as other denominations may teach, but there's still that, like, I have to prove that I'm the
Yes.
worthy vessel or the object of grace, or whatever.
And that whole image of like Jesus, on the day that you die, being like, depart from me, I never knew you because you didn't do
Mhm.
enough for me or whatever, like that's what goes through your mind. There's just so many mixed messages from the church, the idea you can't fall away because you've been chosen, but that some people do fall away because that's how people
Yeah.
talk all the time.
The one or two friends that we have kept from all the way back to when we were in a PCA church, it was really hard for them because, yeah, they are still in a PCA church, and they knew us at our like super most love Jesus, very spiritual Christian time. And a friend of mine, she was like, I don't know how to interpret this from
Mm,
what I'm convinced is true, because I have no reason to think y'all were never Christians.
right.
So she's kind of hoping, I guess, we'll come back or
I
something. Like, I'm
know.
not really sure. It gets, yeah, like you said, there's so many mixed messages. It's but oh,
And that's
yeah,
that message. It's like, well, if you left, you must never have been a Christian. And yet, and so we hear that all the time. And yet people are realizing that's bullshit because we were like, most of us who are leaving, a lot of us who are leaving were like the most faithful kids. Okay, there's no denying, right, that we were, because we were the leaders at the VBS. We were the ones singing the songs. We were the volunteers. We were doing the worship team, whatever. So if we weren't a Christian, right, then what? Show me somebody who is then. Okay. So yeah, I think it's just a false argument to make people feel safe, obviously.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
So how would you, when you say God or spirit or universe, what is your definition? Or is it just like you said, expansive? There's not
Yeah.
really
Oh
like
man.
a set.
Yeah, I think I don't have a definition anymore. I don't
Okay.
want to try and define it. I have my experience, and that's all I really have. And I know that's very subjective. And I'm even aware that, it could be higher self, or it could be, I'll often refer to it higher self, universe, something bigger than me. Okay. That seems to have a little bit different perspective from where I'm at right now. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in IFS, which is what I use with psychology, it's the parts work modality, we teach getting in touch with yourself. Okay. So there's all these parts. And, they all have different motivations. Some are protectors, some are firefighters, and some are child parts, exiles that are hurt. And so they all have these motivations and these emotions running around. And yet in the center of all this, we have this thing called self, okay, that can kind of parent all of these other parts and take care of them. And Richard Schwartz, who developed this modality, says he can see this in every human he's ever been able to work with. Okay. He is able to find this beautiful core self that's able to touch in and parent these other parts and find compassion, calm, clarity, just a sense of peace. Okay. And he goes on in his books to kind of talk about this extending even beyond, he's not Christian, which is funny. So, but it extends into a bigger self, almost as if we're all little parts in humanity. And there's kind of a big self that's connecting all of us too. And I like that idea. I like the idea of connectedness, of us all being connected together. That seems to be kind of where my beliefs are going. And yet knowing that I can rely on something or touch into something bigger than me, but that I'm also a part of, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
their wisdom is there for me to tap into, and it may be bigger than me, but it's not necessarily separate from me.
I like that. That, like, That hits me in my heart. I like that.
Aw, yeah.
So, boundless and free. Is there anything I did not ask that you want to make sure that you talk about?
I think, no, those are the biggest things. I mean, of course, there's other things that about my journey that I'll probably share at some point. Obviously, we all have deep things that are a part of our story. I share a little bit more on my page if anyone's interested. And so, more about marriage and relationships and how those evolve. I think that's always really interesting and figuring out one's sexuality. And, I've had an interesting journey with that and relationships and sexuality. And pretty much think I'm poly right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Kind of big to drop at the very end of our thing, but
Hey, you're not the first guest,
yeah.
and you won't be the last guest.
But at the same time, I'm not even that concerned with sticking with that definition. I think I'm also probably on the bisexual spectrum as well, maybe, but I'm still also just kind of like, maybe, I'm not sure. I don't need to define it. But the biggest thing about that is it's such a shame because we weren't allowed to even wonder about that when we were younger. This was not even an option for us to think about.
Yeah, none of those terms were even allowed. It was straight or sinful.
Yeah. You could not have a relationship with God and, have anything other than a straight personality, cis straight personality. So, and I'm just seeing that, I think, crumble all around in myself and in so many others, So it's pretty fascinating. It's kind of fun to watch. And, that, and then just this message of the sinfulness and the depravity that we were taught is one that I want to fight against for the rest of my life, I think, because I just don't think it's true. So, and it's very harmful. And I think we deserve to let go of that message. And, we can make mistakes, but that doesn't mean we're inherently sinful and depraved and bad. So, yeah.
I always think of Brene Brown, how she defines guilt and shame.
Yes, exactly.
The guilt is, oh no, I did a bad thing. Shame is, I am bad.
Yes.
And that's what we're taught, is just like,
yes, exactly.
You are bad. You need a savior. And it's just like, no, this is not.
No, it's not.
Well, Boundless and Free, thank you so much. We will have in the show notes your Instagram account, and anything else that you send us, we'll share with everyone so they can find you online.
Great. Thank you so much.
Final thoughts on the episode. I think if a Christian believer were to listen to Boundless and Free or this podcast as we use the term religious trauma, they would have very little frame of reference to understand what is being described. But I think Boundless and Free makes this very clear that before she even knew the term religious trauma, she was feeling something wrong. She was learning about complex PTSD and recognizing some of those symptoms in herself. She was learning about trauma being held in the body and those reactions. So that anxiety, that depression that she experienced. And Boundless and Free mentions yet another very common story I hear from our guests, that at some point in time, just setting foot into a church causes these trauma responses. If that imaginary Christian believer were listening and was skeptical that this is a real thing, I can tell you I've had multiple guests on who have experienced religious trauma. And prior to someone like Marlene Winnell and her book, Leaving the Fold, we didn't even have the word or the concept of religious trauma. I think this is a field of study that will expand over the next decades. And the main message, I think, that Arline and I and Boundless and Free would want you to take from this is, if you are experiencing PTSD-like symptoms, anxiety, depression, if especially you find that being in the context of church feels triggering, for lack of a better term, but in a way that you can't even describe, you may be experiencing religious trauma. And all of us would agree that finding a good therapist and being able to talk through that trauma is one of the most important things that you can do. We will have links in the show notes for the Secular Therapy Project as well as the Religious Trauma Institute. These are therapists that you can go to where you know you can trust. They are not going to just tell you that you need to pray more or read your Bible more or add further burdens to the religious trauma you may be experiencing. Another subject that Boundless and Free brings up that is a reoccurring theme is the impact of purity culture. One of the most insightful things that Arline and Boundless and Free got to was the idea that the church teaches that women's bodies are bad or evil or sexual, and men's minds are bad or evil or sexual. And I think it was kind of both Arline and Boundless and Free to acknowledge that purity culture also affects men. I want to be 100% clear here that the brunt of purity culture trauma-inducing force is absorbed by women and the messages that the church drives into women from an early age. I also want to make it clear that the impact on the LGBTQ community is immeasurable. So for those people who didn't fit in gender or sexuality norms, that was even more traumatic. And it's interesting that Boundless and Free's husband was somewhat asexual or has grown into demisexual in a way that we've heard before. We've heard from other guests a very similar story. So again, going back to our imaginary Christian believer who's listening, there are real life stories of people who did all the right things. They waited until marriage to have sex. And when they got married, they found that they couldn't let go of the messaging that had been pounded into them their entire lives growing up. And sex was not pleasurable. Sex was not intimate and wonderful. It was damaged in some way or another. So the messages of purity culture hurt people, men and women, and members of the LGBTQ community in deep and profound ways. And again, we at the podcast here are very pro-therapy. And if you find yourself having experienced the damage, the trauma from purity culture, please reach out to a secular therapist and begin the process of, in Boundless and Free's terminology, embodying yourself and accepting your own sexuality and enjoying your sex life. I want to thank Arline for guest hosting today, and definitely want to thank Boundless and Free for sharing her wisdom and experience. You can find Boundless and Free on Instagram at boundless_and_free. We will definitely have links in the show notes. I highly recommend that you check her online presence out. Thank you, Boundless and Free, for being on the podcast. The secular grace thought of the week is accepting your own humanity. Here at the podcast, we are advocating for a humanism, whether that is a religious humanism with a spiritual dimension or a secular humanism with a completely naturalistic worldview. It is the focus on people, that we believe in people. And that must begin with accepting your own humanity. So much of the damage of religious trauma and the trauma from purity culture comes from internalizing, either implicitly or, in the case of Calvinism, explicitly, that you are a bad person. Your righteousness is as filthy rags, that even your best is damaged in some way or another. I have a blog post that I'm going to have links to in the show notes, the title of which is "You Are Not Broken, You Are Human." You are just a human being, and human beings are a complex mix of wonderful things and terrible things, and you are not a bad person. Your righteousness is righteous. The mistakes you make are your mistakes, and you need to own those as well. But you are not a fundamentally broken, damaged person. You are a human being. And the messages of the church are damaging. I came to realize that even my focus on grace was not enough, that the dark side of grace was that you had to be a sinner and accept that fact in order to accept love. The message of this podcast is We love each other, human being to human being. And in order to be able to give that love to someone else, you have to be able to accept yourself as a human being. Embrace your humanity, revel in your humanity, and the freedom that that can bring you. As always, we have some amazing interviews coming up. Next week is Joe Simonetta. He is quite a character, but he has written a number of books. He is a secular humanist and has a specific focus on how we need to live in the world in order to be connected with ourselves, with each other, and the environment. After that, we have Heather Wells. Heather has written a book called Trustworthy, and it is a harrowing story of being married young, the impact of purity culture, in a loveless marriage where she was trying to take care of her entire family. And it's a hardcore story, but it ends in her gaining education, gaining a career, and finding real love. So look forward to that. We also have Nathan and Todd from Beyond Atheism, the podcast. I want you to check that podcast out. It is a sister or cousin podcast. They're doing great things over there. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.